Ladies and gentlemen, today is January the 11th, 2026, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, Godzilla, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Hello?
Hey, how are you?
Yo. Doing well. We're just actually mentioning our intro sequence for the show. Very similar to the first Jurassic Park movie, here in World Discussion we use practical effects instead of CGI. So the echo effect that you're hearing is actually just me saying Smith multiple times rather than a real echo. So that's pretty cool.
Well played.
Yeah. Starting this week, I begin a Road to Immortal 10 push-ups per death. I'm just going to do 10 push-ups every time I die, every time I play ranked, just to really make myself try hard, because I don't want to do more push-ups. I've done 700 in the past 3 days-ish, so it's a lot. But I just had a deathless game, so it's paying off in making me extra aware of danger, just playing really on the safe side, because the position that I'm playing in Dota is safe lane, which you're supposed to be the most focused on your own farm. You're fighting neutral creeps, you're fighting the lane creeps, and just trying to get as rich as you can while avoiding as many fights as you can in most cases. I've been able to dip in, but having that push-up challenge means that I don't want to frontline or take silly risks if my hero's not built to do so. And most of my heroes are not. So it's been pretty cool. I've had a winning record all but one of the days, and the day that wasn't a winning record was a break-even day. So we'll see where that takes us and how long it takes, but today is day 4, and we've gone 2-1 for the day. And this was all kind of spurred on by me having a particularly horrendous session. I think it was Wednesday of last week. I think it was Wednesday, and I went 2 wins and 10 losses across a maybe 10-hour stream, and that's like dropping you down a full bracket of MMR. You go from whatever star you have. I think I was Ancient 4, and then I dropped down all the way to Ancient 3 in one session, and it made me feel kind of like this can't just be my teams, right? Maybe it is, but there's probably stuff that I'm not doing as well. And I felt kind of sleepy and groggy that day. So, yeah, just me focusing on doing a little bit of workout between my matches to break up the monotony of sitting for long periods of time.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's been good.
Does your cat have something to add?
Yeah, he's been very attention-seeky today. My brother's away, so I am the entertainment in the house.
Gotcha.
But chat likes him.
Huh?
Chat likes him. He has a very loud purr. I don't know if it's audible on Discord. I have a little bit of the noise canceling for the volume threshold, so it might not pick up. But there have been a few things this week that have stood out to me that people have been buzzing about. I'm not sure how impactful they are in the grand scheme of things, but the biggest ticket item, from what I could tell, was maybe the situation in Iran. That seemed pretty crazy. As soon as I saw mosques being burned, I was like, holy shit, that's black metal. That's what the Norwegians did, like burning their churches for metal music and stuff. And now, is Iran going to have a new wave of black metal? Like resisting society and traditions and resisting religion?
Yeah, they've been escalating. They're thoroughgoing nationwide protests at this point. Yeah, it's not really clear what's going to happen there. From the analysis I've read, there seems to be a consensus that it's unlikely that the government will be overthrown. The protesters don't really have any kind of coherent leadership or alternative that can kind of slip into the role of alternative government to replace what's already there. And Iran has a state apparatus of repression that's quite experienced. So they've gotten pretty good at dealing with these kinds of things. They may not be able to suppress the protests in the short term, but they probably can stop them from, say, overthrowing the government or something like that.
And they just straight up kill protesters, right? I think hundreds of people have been killed.
Correct. Yeah, they started the crackdown pretty early, and that's been pretty well ongoing. I don't think it's anything especially organized. I don't think there's like a general order to just shoot on sight, but local governments have done that. And keep in mind that in Iran, there's probably, I don't know, around a third of the population, let's say, if not more, which are kind of hardcore pro-government. The government of Iran is not just like a despotic one-man dictatorship, right? It actually does have some populist roots in Iran. There is genuinely a decent number of Islamists in the country that, even if they have their criticisms of some of the things that the Iranian government has done, and especially their management of the economy, certainly the corruption is unpopular, even amongst government supporters. But even given all of that, like, they would still prefer the clerical authoritarian government over an alternative. They believe the problems that the country has can be solved via reform, and that full democratization or other form of revolutionary change in government is unnecessary. So they're going to back the government probably no matter what. And even if that's a minority of the country, that's a relatively strong base to work with. And keep in mind, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is pretty much just chock full of people like that. Yeah, I think even if the government were overthrown, it's less likely that that would result in democratization than in the IRGC just formally seizing power for itself. That seems more likely to me than a sort of liberal democratic Iran.
Yeah, I guess the question for me would be, have the people articulated any key things they want done differently?
No.
So they can have a unified front on something? So they're just pissed.
No. Yeah. I mean, keep in mind, the people who are upset at the government are not a block monolith. There's a variety of political factions within Iran who are upset at the government for a variety of reasons. The West tends to fixate on the sort of young liberal reformers, kind of the student protesters, basically, the young women, the urbanites, people like that. But there's not really enough of those people by themselves to really bring down the government. So when the protests get really big like this, it's generally not just because that particular group is upset. It's because other groups are also upset, and those groups are not especially liberal or modernist, etc. Most of them are just angry about economic conditions and about corruption in the government. Like I mentioned, you can be an Islamist backer of the government and still be unhappy with the corruption.
Yeah. I see.
So that's a bigger factor there for the scale of the protests. You can kind of see something similar in Serbia, actually, because the mainstay of Serbia's opposition are liberal democratic reformers. But there's not enough of them to really challenge the government. What's really kept the protests in Serbia going has been a kind of coalition between liberal democratic reformers and conservative nationalists who don't like the government's corruption. So they don't necessarily, that is to say, the conservative nationalists don't necessarily want a fully liberalized democratic Serbia, or at least certainly not a liberalized one. But they're upset enough at the corruption to want to pressure the government into some degree of reform. And they're willing to team up with their nominal rivals in the liberal democratic camp in order to make that happen. So that's kind of more representative of what's going on in Iran right now, rather than just some broad-based desire to completely democratize and liberalize the country's politics.
Yeah, they just want to make their current system slightly better in their way.
Mhm.
And there are some people who want to use more of a Western model, but it's not a strong enough majority that they're just going to change it into that all of a sudden.
Yeah, correct. That's my reading anyway.
I see.
The Trump administration, meanwhile, has been bloviating about how the Iranian government cracks down and they're going to intervene somehow. Lindsey Graham is in full bloodlust mode. He was talking recently about how he wants the president to scare the mullahs. He thinks the president needs to kill the people responsible for the crackdown.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoever made that call, we'll go get him. Interesting.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham has a track record of that kind of belligerence, so it doesn't surprise me. I don't think it's going to happen. For one, they've already been cracking down, so that threat is obviously not deterring them. But I don't think it would be especially smart. And there's been some pushback in the Senate recently. It seems to be the theme for the past week or two. There's skepticism in the U.S. Senate about the Trump administration's foreign adventurism lately. They're not really comfortable with it. They actually had a vote on whether or not to use the War Powers Act to restrict the administration from potentially getting into a conflict in Venezuela, since they've been threatening more airstrikes, basically, if the Rodriguez administration at this point doesn't do what they tell them to. So the Senate didn't particularly like that, and they actually voted to do that. It's not going to get past the House, so it's more symbolic, but it is a rare act of pushback by the Republican-controlled Senate. And then in the past couple days, they've been making similar noises about criticizing the president over potential intervention in Iran. And I think Rand Paul in particular came out and said that it could have the opposite of the intended effect. Could have an effect that is the opposite of that intended. Basically, that there could be a rally around the flag effect in the country if the administration intervenes, since basically the protesters at that point would be explicitly linked to American intervention, which is not a good look in Iran.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ayatollah already came out, I think, a couple days ago and said that the protesters were just doing the bidding of Donald Trump. That's the government's framing. So if the U.S. government intervenes directly, using violence on behalf of the protesters, that kind of lends credence to that narrative, even if it's mostly bullshit. Yeah, I don't think anybody thinks the Trump administration especially gives a shit about liberal democracy anywhere, let alone Iran. So I don't think they're fooling anybody by trying to pretend that they, quote unquote, want what's best for the Iranian people. Nobody's falling for that at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure that's an issue that Trump himself has been concerned with for a long time.
Yeah, I'll bet. I'll bet he has a big bleeding heart. Yeah, so nobody believes that. So everybody just assumes that he's doing it because he wants to destabilize the Iranian government. I don't think anybody would expect anything good to happen from some kind of American puppet. Oh, speaking of that, the son of the Shah, whom actually was a de facto American puppet in Iran, he's still alive, apparently. He's in the United States, and he's been posting online that he's going to come back to Iran and oversee democratization.
I'll be back.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Boris
I'm pretty
Johnson.
dubious.
He did come back, though, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think most people in Iran remember the Shah's era very fondly. I think it looks better in retrospect to some people because of the clerical rule in Iran since 1979, but there's still plenty of people that remember what it was like during the Shah's time. It was pretty authoritarian in its own right. Yeah, I have read that there are some people in Iran who have been protesting and chanting about bringing back the Shah. I don't know how widespread that sentiment is. In general, I'm pretty dubious about it.
He took a more Western stance to things. I think That was when people dressed in a more Western manner as well.
People in the capital did, and maybe some of the larger cities, but it was not representative of the population as a whole.
Ah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty common in pretty much any country, and I guess Iran was never colonized, but basically what you might call the developing world in the early mid 20th century generally had elites who were westernized to one degree or another and dressed in a Western fashion and kept up with Western style politics, etc., that kind of thing. And they tended, because they were the leadership, to kind of set the tone for public policy, fashion, etc. But their social life, their personal preferences, and this is true for virtually every developing country in that time period, was never representative of most of the population. Most people in those countries still lived very traditional lifestyles that were not that different than they had been centuries, in some cases, maybe even millennia previous. Yeah, the divide between westernized elites and more traditional common folk is a very common political divide in much of the developing world. It's especially stark in places like Africa, where you had people in the interior of Africa who tend to live more traditional lifestyles that are very rural, defined by subsistence agriculture. And then in contrast, you'll have coastal elites who are more urban, been educated in the West, and generally have much more Western sensibilities. Probably Liberia might be the most stark example of that. Since in Liberia, the coastal elite were actually foreigners. They were former African American slaves who were brought over in the 19th century. And they didn't really have a whole lot in common with the native population. And they actually lorded over the native population. The former American slaves had disproportionate political power, and they kind of took over the country and marginalized the native population, which eventually resulted in a civil war in which the former power elite were themselves then marginalized. As far as I know, there's not very many of them left now. It's a pretty similar dynamic. Back in the pre-Shah, well, in the Shah days, in the pre-revolution days, before 79, yes, there were a lot of westernized Iranians, but these were like the economic elite generally, the upper middle class, people like that. And that was not most of the population. And it's specifically because of the rapid economic development and the rapid social changes that were happening on account of that economic development that there was such a strong pushback that resulted in the 79 revolution. So the two are intertwined. It was partly because the country was starting to get too urban and too liberal that the bulk of the population, which was still rural conservative and traditionalist, supported the Shah's return to Iran and the setup of a Islamist government. It's not to say that everybody who resisted the Shah was like an Islamist. There were socialists and liberal Democrats and a whole myriad variety of different political actors wanted the Shah out. But ultimately, those factions were all weaker than the Islamist conservative faction. You know, the clerisy had the backing of far too many people to ultimately be resisted when they made a power play. And so those other groups ended up getting marginalized during and after the revolution. Yeah, that's why I say that there is a core of support for the current government in Iran. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of people don't like it, but there are genuine Islamist ideologues in the country that prefer clerical rule, even if they might like for it to reform in some regards. They would still prefer a revolutionary Islamist government than some kind of alternative because of ideological reasons. That makes it distinct from something like, say, Putin's Russia, where the government really doesn't have an ideology. And that makes it a little bit weaker There's not really like an inherent constituency of people in Russia that necessarily would go to bat for Putin's government, because it doesn't really stand for anything per se. In so much as people support him, it's more because they fear that there would just be something worse if he ended up getting pushed out. But in Iran, by contrast, they actually do have an ideology there that has some currency, and that actually gives the government relatively more legitimacy and support than it would have otherwise, and that's a big reason why it's lasted as long as it has, and will probably last for a good deal longer. Generally, authoritarian regimes like that have the same lifespan as a human. So like 70, 80 years, thereabouts. And Iran isn't 70 to 80 years old yet. The revolutionary government is only, like 40, 50 years old? So they probably got another couple decades in them before the regime really kind of collapses of its own accord. But even if they do collapse, I would not be optimistic about what comes after. We've seen a lot of failed transitions over the past couple decades. I suspect Iran may well be another one.
Power vacuums and you.
Yeah.
Well, on the topic of U.S. intervention, there's been a lot of playful banter about Greenland.
Yeah. I'm still inclined to think it's cheap talk, but you can never be 100% certain. And as far as cheap talk goes, this is fairly damaging for the credibility of U.S. foreign policy. Because the United States has outstanding security commitments to Denmark and Greenland, for that matter. And this undermines those. There's exactly zero reason to do it. It's totally irrational. There isn't any reason the United States needs to invade Greenland or buy it or anything else. Everything the United States wants out of Greenland, it can get right now. You want mining? Go mine stuff. They're not stopping American mining companies from mining in Greenland. In so much as they're not mining already, it's mostly just because it's really fucking expensive, right? Given the climate, the terrain, etc., that's not an easy place to operate in. That's the main difficulty there.
Why don't you go there, stand there for 30 minutes outside and tell us this is land that we want? Greenland is very, very hostile. I was talking with my parents about this at dinner today and saying that, well, we already have a U.S. base on Greenland, so we have military access to the island, so nothing changes for us there. And we're allies with who owns it, so if we want anything about Greenland, we could just talk to them about that. And the space that it takes up on the map for a 2D map is inflated anyway. It's not even that big. It's because it's right near the pole.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some map distortion there.
They have no trees.
True. For anybody curious, there's a website called True Size Of that actually lets you compare country sizes while controlling for map distortion. So you can type in Greenland and get an idea of how large it actually is relative to other countries.
True size of Djibouti.
Yes.
It's pretty close to the equator.
Yeah. Yes, the size you see on a Robertson projection is probably fairly accurate for Djibouti. But yeah, with military access and mining access already, there's no advantage to having control over it. Trump was saying a few days ago that, we need to control it, otherwise the Chinese and the Russians will seize it.
That's so far from them.
Yeah, it's not credible. That's dumb.
I guess Russia could go over the Arctic, but that's really hostile.
I mean, there's American troops there, even if they did go. So, it's not workable in any way, shape, or form. He's just talking out of his ass again.
Stuff that would look good on a map.
Yeah. It's ridiculous. I don't take it seriously. I did read a piece in, I think, The Guardian or The Mail or something about potentially he may have actually asked the U.S. military to draw up a contingency plan. But even that, I suspect, might be cheap talk on his part. Because if you were really having, if you were really drawing up a contingency plan, you wouldn't tell the media about it.
Yeah.
So I suspect he did that on purpose, just to try to scare Copenhagen. Yeah, what was I reading? Supposedly, the U.S. government was considering lump sum payments to the citizens of Greenland in order to try to get them to support becoming part of the United States. Something like $100,000 a head. I don't think it's going to work. Most people in Greenland are not interested in being part of the United States, according to polling.
There are hardly any people there.
It's about 60,000, I think.
Yeah.
It's very small.
So funny.
Yeah, they do have a desire in their politics for independence, but even that comes with a caveat. Basically, in polling, when they ask if they want Greenland to be independent, most people in Greenland say yes. However, if they also ask them in polling if they would still want to be independent if it meant they would lose subsidies from Denmark, especially the free healthcare subsidies that they get, then the answer is actually no. A majority in that case say they would rather not be independent. And given that if they did become independent, they would definitely lose the subsidies, then one really has to question how committed they actually are to independence.
Do you want to be independent? Yes. Okay, your medicine's going away. Actually, we don't want to be independent.
Yep, that pretty much sums it up. But my projection is that this is a story that just kind of goes away in a week or two.
I see.
At least I hope so. The administration seems to be unusually dumb in January of the new year. So who's to say? But I'm still inclined to ascribe it to cheap talk.
The January 6th reference. Okay, so the other notes that I had, there was a Minnesota shooting. What was that?
Have you not seen this?
Is this the ICE person who shot somebody?
Yeah.
Yes, I did see some of it.
Okay. I mean, we don't really have all of the details, but we just know that there was a woman who was possibly blocking ICE with her car, but she may have also just been dropping somebody off. That much isn't really clear to me. Regardless, some ICE agents approached her and demanded that she get out of the car, which she refused to do. And then when she drove off, one of the agents said that she was trying to run him over and then shot her to death. So they released the body cam footage from the officer in question, and he was standing in front of the vehicle, and she did drive off and looked like she might hit him. But it's not clear that she was explicitly trying to run him over, and he did step out of the way and shoot into the side of the car, which he's not supposed to do. So it's one of those edge cases. This is actually not unprecedented. You know, if you are the kind of person who watches videos of police shootings, you've probably seen a case like this where a police officer shot into a moving vehicle because he thought it was trying to run him over. And if you've read about those cases, the officer generally gets off, because that is technically a legitimate use of force. But in this case, it's a little more ambiguous as to whether or not she was, like, again, explicitly trying to hit him, and if he was actually in sufficient danger to justify discharging his weapon. So that's really what the internet has been arguing about since it happened. I expect most likely he's going to get off. I think that would be the case even if there were like a genuine investigation. But it's especially the most likely outcome because there's not going to be a genuine investigation. The DOJ is monopolizing the case. They're not allowing the state of Minnesota to participate. And because, as everybody knows now, the DOJ has been thoroughly politicized by the Trump administration, it's almost certainly the case that the outcome of the case is predetermined. So I would be very surprised if that case actually went anywhere, or if they even brought up any charges at all. Yeah, there is some meta commentary to maybe get into about whether or not this was actually the desired outcome for the administration. Since if you send, armed agents into civilian areas to do things that are not popular in those areas, you're guaranteed to get pushback. So it may be that this was the kind of theater the administration was hoping to use, since this has been quite popular, as you might imagine, with his core base of supporters. And Kristi Noem did come out and announce that they were going to send several hundred more agents to Minnesota in the wake of the shooting. So it seems like their response to this has been to escalate. So you may actually see more of this before too long. Yeah, just partisan hackery, pretty much. Like, even if it's technically legal, previous administrations on both right and left have generally practiced forbearance to make sure that confrontations like this are minimized or just don't happen at all. But that's not really the approach of the Trump administration, which prefers partisan confrontation. It results in unnecessary violence. Like, this outcome is pretty much preordained. You can expect it, regardless of whether or not it's legal or not. Like, it's gonna happen. Police are specifically trained about this kind of stuff. Like, even if you, as the police officer, are in the right, like, you can expect in many circumstances to deal with recalcitrant people, and you need to practice forbearance in those cases. But that's not the philosophy of the current administration, so you get this stuff. Performative violence, if you like.
Forbearance, good word.
Yeah, it had been one of the cornerstone of American political culture. It was one of the important unspoken norms of American politics. But we all know how the Trump administration deals with norms.
They don't.
So that's, yeah. Yeah, so that's a big reason why we are where we are right now. But look on the bright side, at least half of the country is thoroughly entertained.
Oh.
A lot of people voted explicitly for something like this.
Yeah, I think that's a preference towards someone who is confirming a lot of your existing worldviews and beliefs, and then also just more authoritarian shit. More telling people what to do, structuring society in a way that at least a majority or whoever's in power kind of agrees on. Yeah, it would be interesting to get a kind of satisfaction feedback from people who are conservative, maybe like traditionally conservative and not MAGA Republicans. How would you rate the current administration from 1 to 10, where 10 is the best and 0 is the worst? As a conservative.
You're going to get a lot of variance there. Because conservatives are a very diverse group in their own right. People tend to underestimate just how many factions there are in American politics. Yeah, the Democratic and Republican Party establishments prefer people to think of American politics as being binary, because it's easier to manage that from their perspective. They can get people riled up very easily with that kind of binary tribalistic framing. But the reality is that American politics is just as diverse, if not more so, than any other country. There's a whole litany of different factions in American politics. And they very frequently don't get along with each other, even when they're technically in the same coalition.
Oh, and then I was just kind of curious if there had been any updates in the Maduro situation.
Yes. Not explicitly about Maduro himself, but like on Venezuela.
I've noticed a lot of selfies where he's like chilling with people. People like posting those.
Yeah. Yeah, he seems to be having a chill time in custody. Oh, there was one note about Iran I didn't get to, so I'll just throw this out there too. The Iranian government responded to the threats from the Trump administration by saying that if the United States attacked them, then they would strike U.S. bases as well as Israel. So there's that. I don't know how much of a deterrence that's going to be. You know, it didn't really stop the Trump administration from striking their nuclear facilities over the summer, but nominally there will be some pushback if the United States intercedes. So we'll see how much they do that if and when Washington decides to do so. So that said, Venezuela. Let's see, I thought this was kind of weird, and this is a little bit of a side note regarding Venezuela. So the United States has this blockade, quote unquote. It's actually a partial blockade since they're not stopping all shipping into Venezuela. My understanding is that they're targeting specifically sanctioned tankers, which means that there actually are oil tankers coming and going from Venezuela. You know, the ones that say are shipping Chevron-owned oil. Those are allowed to come and go. And it may also include actually tankers taking oil for China and other countries. It's specifically those ships that are taking oil that are part of the shadow fleet, which are basically taking oil and selling it to other sanctioned countries that have been targeted. So it's not a full blockade, so to speak. So the United States, you know, as we've talked about before, has been seizing shadow fleet tankers. But apparently there was one that they couldn't get, which surprised me. You know, they took two, and then there was a third one, and the Coast Guard released a statement saying that, you know, they were working on it. Apparently they lacked the capacity to take it, which kind of surprised me. So this ship actually made a run for the Atlantic, and it looked like they might even get away. And they actually made it, I think, to somewhere near Iceland, where they received an escort from the Russian Navy. I think there was like a Russian submarine that actually met them up there. And it was then that the US Navy actually seized it anyway, even in spite of the Russian escort, which was a little bit embarrassing for Moscow. But they were able finally to actually seize the ship after tracking it for like a week or so. I have no idea why it took them so long. That kind of caught me off guard, and I still don't know entirely what the delay was about. Moscow has since said that it wasn't actually their ship, which kind of sounds a little bit like a cope. Because the ship itself had kind of run the Russian flag and tried to make the argument that, you know, they could not be boarded. And none of it mattered. Washington just took it anyway. So Moscow kind of did some dancing in order to try to get out of the humiliation that came out of that. Russian state media was not happy about it. They didn't really buy Moscow's argumentation either. Yeah, Caracas has been trying to run the blockade, so to speak. I don't really know how successful they've been. I think we're up to 5 tankers that the U.S. Navy has seized now. So anyway, that's the state of the blockade. I thought it was worth mentioning. Let's see. So the update on Venezuela. So we'll start with the deal that was announced. The Trump administration said that they had reached some kind of deal with the Venezuelan government, wherein they would turn over something like 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the United States government. And the US government would then sell it and then keep the proceeds in order to compensate somebody, I don't think it was ever really clear who, for the theft, quote unquote, for American oil, of American oil companies from the nationalizations that occurred previously under the Chavista government. I think specifically Chavez. Venezuela's oil assets were nationalized in the 70s, but in the, I want to say, aughts, the mid-aughts, Hugo Chavez basically kicked out a number of American oil companies, effectively seizing their shares of the state-owned oil company, seizing their assets, and ejecting them from the country. That event is more, I think, anyway, what the Trump administration is talking about when it talks about quote-unquote stolen oil. So supposedly this oil that Caracas is going to turn over is going to be some kind of repayment rather, to try to address those damages. It's going to be about $2 billion worth of oil in total, which actually is not that much in oil terms. Let's see. So this led into some revelations from Marco Rubio, who went on to the Sunday talk show circuit, which is still a thing. I haven't watched one in years, but they still do them. For those of you from outside the United States who don't know what this is, there's a number of political talk shows in the United States that run weekly on Sunday mornings. Some of these are the oldest TV shows ongoing in the United States. And they're very frequently used by politicians in government to kind of outline their preferred public policy, their positions, and sometimes to explain stuff that they've already done. So no surprise that Marco Rubio would go on to one in order to try to explain all of the bullshit happening with Venezuela. Yeah. So Marco Rubio went on to one of these Sunday talk shows, political talk shows, and he actually, for the first time, elaborated some of what the administration's vision is for how it's going to deal with the Venezuela situation. So I thought this was kind of humorous. The first thing he said is that the United States is not, quote unquote, winging it in Venezuela, which is what many had been accusing him of, including myself, the last time we were on here talking about this. So I thought it was pretty funny that he just kind of came out and very explicitly deny it. We have a plan, he says. And so the plan is pretty much as follows. They're seizing the tankers specifically to cut the Venezuelan government off from its oil revenue. And what they want to do is they want to pressure them into agreeing to having the United States government manage the export and sale, as well as the corresponding distribution of oil revenue from those sales on behalf of the Venezuelan government. So Venezuela will turn over its oil to the US government. The US government will market it, sell it, collect the revenue, and will then use control of that revenue as leverage over the Venezuelan government in order to get them to follow Washington's orders, basically. So this seems to be what they have in mind here. And he did elaborate that they're not actually going to be running the country of Venezuela, as Trump had said a few weeks prior. He said that they're going to be running Venezuelan policy, quote unquote. So that seems to be the plan. He went on to elaborate some of the specific demands that they'll be making of the Venezuelan government. So presumably, whether or not the US government actually shares the revenue that the Venezuelan government gives them to sell is going to be contingent on the Venezuelan government doing all or some of the following. One, as far as foreign influence, they're being asked to kick out, quote unquote, China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, and also to sever economic ties with these. They also want the expulsion of Cuban security personnel. And what I read in one of the articles is that they very specifically wanted them to end cooperation with Iran and Cuba of any kind, basically. As far as oil, they want the Venezuelan government to agree to partner exclusively with the US on oil production, and also to favor the United States when selling Venezuela's heavy crude oil. They also wanted the Venezuelan government to demonstrate, quote, a willingness to open up Venezuela's oil industry on terms favorable to US companies, end quote. A couple other priorities that I saw mentioned, including halting illegal migration. That's how the administration frames it anyway. Stopping drug flows and revitalizing oil infrastructure. Now, part of the calculus here for Washington is that they think that Caracas can go a few weeks without being able to export oil, because even if they can't sell it immediately, they can store it for sale later. But eventually they're going to run out of storage, and at that point they're going to have to stop pumping. And when they stop pumping, they're going to be losing revenue on the year, because time is money. Time spent not pumping is time spent not getting oil out of the ground that they can then sell. So their thinking is that eventually their storage will fill up, and then they will be forced to negotiate and to basically surrender to Washington's terms here. So that's the outline that has been provided thus far from Marco Rubio, and then also from various statements, both on the record and off the record, from different administration officials made to media.
Seems like this may have been a plan that was kind of in the works for a while.
Debatable.
Or they're just making it work.
Well, I mean, the raid itself was planned for several months.
Mm-hmm.
So that much was planned well in advance. The other aspects, I'm not so sure about. That's not clear to me. It could be that they were planning this months in advance. That is to say, getting the oil and trying to influence the Venezuelan government's foreign policy is not, if not also its domestic policy. But I don't know, it doesn't feel especially well planned to me. Because I feel like if they did sit down and actually plan ahead, they would have a much more concrete plan than this. Something that's more robust than scare Caracas into doing what we say by stopping them from exporting oil. Because what's going to happen is that the Venezuelan government is going to do a cost benefit. They're going to try to see what the costs of complying with America's demands are. And if they're not too high, then they may well actually do them. They may well actually adhere to Washington's demands on these things. But if they feel like it's asking too much, they may just ignore Washington and basically dare Washington to intervene. Because the Trump administration, as I've said before on here, is fundamentally risk averse. They don't really want a war in Venezuela. They don't want to invade and occupy the country. I suspect that's like the main reason for all of this. They want to do something about Venezuela such that they can establish the credibility of the American government's threats, which I think is the main priority here. But they can't really do that without full intervention. So they're trying to kind of have their cake and eat it too. Mm-hmm. They want to try to get the Venezuelan government to change its ways and effectively become a proxy for Washington without all of the drama of an actual invasion and occupation. And it's asking too much, in my opinion. I don't think they can do that. At the end of the day, the Venezuelan government, as an authoritarian government, is principally concerned with its survival. So anything that threatens that is a non-starter. They may lie and pretend to go along with this, that, or the other American demand regarding change of government, democratization, etc., but I don't think it'll be anything more than lies. Those promises will not be credible, at least not to me. That said, I don't even know that the US government actually cares about democratization in Venezuela. And I have a sneaking suspicion Trump himself may have a vision of a Saudi Arabia-style relationship with the Chavista government, where the United States turns a blind eye to human rights abuses in exchange for oil, basically, for a stable flow and supply of oil. And that would be pretty ironic, because that's basically been the Venezuelan government's position for several years now. The Venezuelan government wanted American oil companies to come back to Venezuela and invest so that they could restart oil production and start making more money again, since they've obviously very much been hurting for revenue on account of the collapse in oil production. But oil companies couldn't do that on account of sanctions, among just general risk aversion. And the US government, for its part, conditioned relaxation of sanctions on an improvement in the human rights situation, as well as on some degree of democratization, or at least steps in that direction. So if the Trump administration is not serious about democratization in Venezuela, if that's just a fig leaf to try to mask some more realist-style deal in which they trade recognition for oil, the Venezuelan government may then actually just be getting its way. The American government will have effectively adopted the Venezuelan position. I'm sure the Venezuelan government would prefer to control their own oil exports. They won't be happy about the US controlling them, but even if the US only ends up giving a fraction of that revenue to the Venezuelan government for adhering to demands that are seen by the Venezuelan government as not threatening their hold on power, that's still revenue they didn't have before. That's still an improvement on the status quo. And that may well be a trade-off they're willing to make. So I don't know if that's what's going to end up happening. But given that I don't think the Trump administration actually cares about political transition in Venezuela, I think that would be the intuitive direction of travel for them. We'll see. But I think when all is said and done, we may end up with a dramatically different status quo than a lot of people had expected in the immediate aftermath of the Maduro raid. So all of that said, implicit in a lot of this planning is that it's imperative that the United States, and more specifically its oil companies, get back into Venezuela so that they can gain access to the oil, which will then presumably be a strategic asset for the United States. And what we're finding out in the past week, what we have found out in the past week, is that that's not really all that rational. Because Trump actually met with a number of oil executives in the past week, and a number of them expressed a great deal of skepticism about investment in Venezuela's oil industry. In fact, there was one of them, I can't remember which company it was, but one of the CEOs explicitly told Trump that Venezuela was, quote unquote, uninvestable. So even if the Trump administration gets everything at once here, it may be that there's not going to be a resulting increase in oil production or even a return of US oil companies to Venezuela. They are not really enthusiastic about getting involved in Venezuela again. They've been burned before because of nationalization. It's not an especially safe investment on account of, the lack of law and order generally and the relatively poor security situation in many parts of the country. And keep in mind, too, while Venezuela does have very large reserves of oil, they're fairly low quality, which means it's pretty expensive to extract them and refine them. So the capital investment that would be necessary to exploit that particular set of oil reserves in Venezuela would be especially expensive. And it's the expense of those investments that makes the companies in question especially risk averse. Even if he expense was lower, they would be reluctant, but they're especially reluctant with investments of this scale. There actually are some light crude reserves in Venezuela, I think more in the northwestern part of the country. Maybe you could see some investment there, since that would be cheaper. So the cost benefit is more favorable, but even there, a lot of the oil majors may prefer to aver. There's better options. Like, they've got other choices, other stuff that they can invest in, basically, that is safer and will likely offer a better return. And keep in mind, too, the Trump administration is only, nominally anyway, going to be around for another 3-some years. It feels like it's been longer than 1 year, but there are 3 years to go of the Trump administration. But after that, who's to say? Like, you don't know what happens after that, and it may be that a new administration does not care to go to bat for oil companies that made big investments in Venezuela, in which case they may lose all of that money, which is not an attractive prospect. So even with all of this drama about the US government taking control of Venezuela, even in their best case scenario, it may be that American oil companies are just not that interested, which really brings into question, like, what the real strategic value of Venezuela is. This should not be a surprise, really, because even with all of the talk about, China and Russia having a foothold in the Americas in Venezuela, and Trump himself actually came out and talked about trying to eject Russian and Chinese influence from Venezuela as a signal to those countries that they should stay out of America's backyard. That's ignorant. That whole perspective is ignorant because, in fact, there was never much Chinese or Russian influence in Venezuela in the first place, because Venezuela was not like a strong ally for them. It was not a major strategic asset.
It's super far.
It's very far away, but more to the point, like, the main thing that made Venezuela a valuable ally is the oil production, and that collapsed. In general, the administrative capacity of the Chavista government got weaker and weaker over time. Their hold on power is relatively strong, but that's mostly because of state repression, as well as the support of a cohort of the population that is diehard Chavista. Kind of similar to Iran, there's probably like around a third of the population or so that is going to support the Chavistas no matter what. So that gives them a pretty good hold on power. But that said, like, the government just got weaker over time. And like, a weak ally is not that useful to Russia or China, especially one whose main strategic asset, oil, like, they could not offer anymore, realistically, not at the same scale anyway. So all of that combined meant that most of the support that Russia and China voiced for Venezuela was mostly symbolic. Like, it was not substantive. And if it was never substantive, then, like, why worry about Russian or Chinese influence in Venezuela? Like, that didn't mean anything. I'm sure the Venezuelan government would have liked more support, but I think they forbeared on asking, say, China or Russia to do anything dramatic, like, say, deploy troops or, commit to any kind of broader strategic alliance, specifically because they expected that bold a move would have prompted a substantive response from Washington. And I think that substantive response would have come from any administration, not just Trump, but any given normal Democratic or Republican administration probably would have applied significant pressure in response to that. I think that's why the Venezuelans never asked, and I think that's why the Chinese and Russians never pushed it. Like, everybody recognized that any kind of attempt to establish a real military strategic presence in Venezuela would have been met with a pretty dire response. So that never happened, which means that the Venezuelan government was effectively deterred already from embracing China and Russia strategically, which means all of this talk about pushing China and Russia out of Venezuela is bullshit. The whole thing is just theatrics. Mm-hmm. So given all that, like, I still don't take any of it seriously. As dramatic as the Maduro raid was, like, this is not a real strategic move on the part of Washington. Like, the more I learn about this, the more convinced I am that it really was just about the theatrics. There's no strategic rationale. The oil industry doesn't want it. The only people who wanted it are people in the Trump administration. And I don't really put a lot of currency in their ability to form coherent foreign policy objectives.
Well, one of the things
Which
that
really,
you mentioned that I haven't heard other people talk about with regards to Venezuelan oil is the difficulty in obtaining it and refining it. Mostly people just get the first number of, oh, wow, they have more oil than any of the countries in the Middle East or any other country in the world. And it's like, wow, that's a lot, but oil comes in different qualities and it's different levels of convenience to get it. And then the worse it is, the more you have to do to refine it. So,
yeah, I have more numbers on that, actually. Let me see if I can find, I gotta skip down a little bit. Let's see, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so Venezuelan oil is sufficiently expensive to extract and refine that they need a global oil price of around $80 per barrel to be profitable. And oil prices currently are at about $60 a barrel. So this means that Trump can't use Venezuelan oil to lower oil prices in the United States. If Venezuela did significantly increase production to do that, they would be losing huge amounts of money. So unless the US government wants to subsidize them to do that, it's not going to happen. Furthermore, the current state of oil infrastructure in Venezuela is sufficiently poor that it'll probably take about a decade of investment to regain substantive levels of production in the Venezuelan oil industry. So even if the Trump administration got everything it wanted, up to and including oil investment from the private sector in the United States, which is apparently not forthcoming, even in that case, even in that best case scenario, it would still take 10 years for this to even make a dent in oil prices. And on top of all of that, even if Venezuela were able to achieve the peak level of oil production that they had achieved before the decline they experienced in the Chavista years, which was around 30-some years ago, even if their oil production went back to that highest level it had ever been, it's estimated that that would only reduce global oil prices by about $4, which is equivalent to about 10 to 15 cents in gasoline prices in the United States, which is not all that much. Also, fun political economy fact. One of the major industries that supports the Republican Party, and presumably indirectly Trump, is the oil shale industry in the United States. The thing is, oil shale itself is pretty expensive to produce, and they need a price of about $60 a barrel in order just to break even, not even to be profitable. So let's say Venezuela starts pumping out oil and increasing global oil supplies. That's going to reduce the price of oil presumably below somewhere $60 a barrel. And that would actually then, if it happened, push oil prices in the United States below the point that shale producers need to stay in business, which means that they would either have to take on debt until prices increased or declare bankruptcy, which they are not going to like. And in some of the articles I read, there were some industry reps that were saying that they would be very, very unhappy if the Trump administration made Venezuela pump out a whole bunch of oil that's actively going to harm their bottom line. So the interpretation that this is about the oil is every day proven more wrong. Some of the guys in the YouTube comments were quite adamant that I was very wrong about that, but I've been feeling more and more vindicated as time goes on here. It's not about the oil. This is about the Trump administration wanting to be seen to be tough and to establish a precedent. That's what they care about. This is the kind of lumpen realist thinking that got the United States involved in Iraq, which I also think was started for much the same reasons. Not so much about the oil, more about the precedent. Realism is a hell of a drug. There's a lot of guys in Washington that are high on it. I feel sorry for the academics that take realism as a foreign policy school seriously, because it seems like only the biggest clowns end up actually trying to pursue it as a foreign policy once they get into power. That's been my experience my entire life. Realists are excited about an incoming administration having a realist foreign policy, and then a few years later, all of them are writing about how they're doing it wrong. That's not real realism, they say. They shouldn't be doing it like that. And of course, it's a disaster. And then the next administration comes in that is not realist, and then the realists go back to complaining. And then the cycle repeats. There is such a thing as bureaucratic infighting. There are different schools of thought on any number of policy matters, and they do fight with each other. I know people like to be reductive and explain everything in terms of critiques of capitalism, and capitalist firms and whatnot are the chief power behind public policy. There's some truth to that, but it's not the only determinant. You got to branch out if you want a full picture, and a lot of people don't want to do that and get really mad at you if you suggest that they do. YouTube comments being a case in point.
Also, shout out to our lovely commenters from YouTube. Thank you for your engagement.
Well, let's see. We talked about the oil. I skipped ahead a little bit. Let me backtrack here. Okay, so the oil companies are not that interested in investing in Venezuela. So some background info about the vice president, former vice president of Venezuela, now effectively sitting president, interim president, as the Trump administration keeps calling her, Delcy Rodriguez. So apparently, and this is from stuff I've read in the media, basically some people in the Trump administration have been talking to media about this. There was apparently an intelligence assessment that determined that Delcy Rodriguez was the best bet for running an interim government after Maduro was removed. And apparently the assessment was that she's relatively malleable. She's not so much an ideologue, that she's not willing to work with the United States. So that's partly why, for example, the Trump administration did not say move immediately for a transitional government or immediate democratization. They think the intelligence assessment was basically that if they did something that dramatic, then it would be more likely that the government would just collapse due to resistance from intractable institutional resistance from figures like the head of the army and the head of the state intelligence service within Venezuela, whom are hardliners and would presumably resist any such transition. So rather than doing that, they preferred to go with regime insiders, who they think can hold the government together and maintain stability, since they don't want the government to stabilize such that it just collapses and Venezuela is just anarchy, such that nobody can get any oil out, and you get more migrants as well in such a circumstance. Like I said before, the Trump administration is dreaming here. They really are trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have all of the benefit of substantively changing facts on the ground in Venezuelan politics without any of the cost of doing so. So Rodriguez is their bet for now. They're going to go with her. Some of the other figures in Venezuelan politics, like Edmundo Gonzalez and Mikado, whom are the leading opposition figures, they're not really giving them the time of day. Their assessment is that these people are going to struggle to gain legitimacy among the broader public, and that they also don't have the chops to deal with the massive institutional pushback they're going to get from pro-regime actors. So it's worth kind of going through some of the main figures here within this current regime. Already talked about Rodriguez, a little more about her in a minute. The interior minister, the guy who heads the intelligence service and the internal security apparatus in Venezuela, is a guy named Diosdado Cabello. That's my best attempt at pronunciation. And then the defense minister, the head of the military, is Vladimir Padrino. So both of these guys are seen as hardliners. hardcore pro-Chavista. They're not interested in knuckling under to American demands, presumably, in so much as there's pushback against the United States, it's going to come from them, more so than Rodriguez. As a side note here, I want to point out that a lot of what we're hearing about Rodriguez, including a rumor that in negotiations a couple months ago between the Venezuelan government and the Trump administration, negotiations in which she was the rep for Venezuela, supposedly she cut a deal with the United States in which Maduro would be removed and she would take his place in exchange for basically her being relatively amenable to American demands. Basically, the United States was going to help her do that, or she was going to help the United States do that in exchange for their support and her becoming president. That rumor stems from reporting from the Miami Herald, as I understand it. However, it's not really clear what the source of that story was, and my pet theory at this juncture is that this is a leak from the Trump administration that is designed to sow discord within the Venezuelan government. Since at this point, it's pretty clear that somebody in the Venezuelan government helped the United States. That seems relatively likely. Certainly wouldn't be a surprise. But by playing up this rumor that Rodriguez is secretly working with the US government and the CIA, they may be sowing discord in order to try to destabilize the government and sow distrust between major actors, such that they're less willing to take action against the United States. Basically, you don't know who might be working for Washington, and so out of fear, you don't do anything too bold that might challenge what the United States wants you to do. I don't know if that's actually going to work in practice, but that makes more sense to me than some kind of secret backroom deal with Rodriguez. And part of the reason I think that is because of this next bit. So Rodriguez apparently has some background in Chavista politics that goes just beyond power mongering. Apparently her father was a Marxist guerrilla in Venezuela during the Cold War. His name was Jorge Antonio Rodriguez, and he was a co-founder of a group called the Socialist League, which was a militant leftist movement active in the 60s and 70s. I'm quoting from the article there. Apparently Rodriguez, this is the daughter here, has asthma that she blames on an incident that occurred when she was visiting her father in prison after he had been arrested for his revolutionary activity. Apparently, while she was visiting her father, she was pushed into his cell, whereupon the guards threw a tear gas grenade into the cell and then locked them in. According to her, this is the source of her asthma. So let's see, going back to before his arrest, in 1976, her father orchestrated I'm just going to quote from the article here. In 1976, her father orchestrated the kidnapping of William F. Niehaus, a U.S. executive at Owen, Illinois, a manufacturer of glass containers. He was accused by his kidnappers of having links to the CIA and was held for more than 3 years until his release in June 79. So this is activity that her father was involved in. Let's see, shortly after directing the abduction, that's when her father was arrested, and he eventually died in state custody in 1976, quote, as a result of torture by officers of Venezuela's secret police, end quote. So at that time, Rodriguez was 7 years old, and apparently this was quite formative for her political views, as one might expect. So if she were just a social climber only interested in power, I could see her as being a viable partner for Washington here. And she does have something of a reputation to that effect. But having that kind of background, not only with her father, but also being an early adopter, so to speak, of the Chavista party and regime, I've got to think she's more ideological than the administration is kind of letting on here. The United States was behind a lot of nasty shit in Latin America, and the Latin American left has never forgotten or forgiven it. They are not joking around when they say they're against American imperialism. For that, American imperialism to them is not academic. That is a real thing that they experienced, quite directly in many cases. So even if she might be more willing to negotiate, I suspect she's going to be a relatively tough negotiator. Now, another guy, the hardliner Padrino, the head of the defense ministry, I have read in a Reuters article that he might be more amenable to American demands than the intelligence assessment mentioned earlier suggested. Supposedly, Washington is going out of their way to seek his collaboration, specifically because he is such an important figure. And what I read is that he might be less dogmatic than Cabello, the head of the intelligence service, and so might be more willing to negotiate a deal with the United States in order to, quote unquote, secure his own safe exit, end quote. Basically, he's not sufficiently dogmatic to want to go to the mat fighting against Western or American influence in Venezuela, and so might be more willing to cut a deal than the more ideological Cabello. So that's a possibility. Rodriguez and Padrino may come together and agree to some kind of deal with the United States that actually sees Washington achieve some of its objectives. And whether or not that works is going to depend then on Cabello and whatever kind of power play he makes. However, this is all basically just what Washington is planning right now, and as we've seen, a lot of Washington's foreign adventures do not pan out. And the Trump administration in particular does not seem very good at planning these, so the track record is not good in that regard. I strongly suspect this is not going to go their way. That's not to say Caracas will not be willing to negotiate to some degree. And that again brings me back to the irony of the Trump administration basically adopting their position. Let's say that the Trump administration demands the following: that Venezuela agree to hand over its oil to the United States for marketing and sale, and agree to basically an arrangement wherein it gets the revenue for those sales on condition of meeting certain objectives outlined by Washington. And let's say that some of those objectives include minimizing ties to Russia, China, ceasing aid to Cuba, since Venezuela has been sending a lot of oil to Cuba as aid over time. They would demand that that be stopped. And then also allowing, quote unquote, American foreign investment in their oil industry, and then also potentially some kind of political transition. So let's say that this is sort of the foundation for what the United States expects of Venezuela in exchange for their oil, for the oil revenue from the sale of the oil they give to Washington. So what Caracas could do is they could stop sending oil to Cuba. That's not that big a deal to them. Cutting ties to Russia and China, like I mentioned earlier, those ties were never strong in the first place. They were largely superficial. Caracas loses effectively nothing by mitigating those ties. And they could probably even just continue them in secret, depending on how much Washington is actually paying attention. But let's say that they cut ties. Doesn't really cost them anything, why not? Agreeing to the arrangement regarding oil, like, sure, like they're not making that much oil anyway. It's still 60% of their government revenue, so it is important, but it's fallen off considerably over time. So long as they're getting at least some oil revenue, they're still doing okay. So they may well be willing to actually agree to that, depending on how it's done. And then what else did I say? Cuba, Russia, China. Oh, political transition. They could just blow that off. They've already released some political prisoners, but that's normal. For like an authoritarian government about to hold negotiations with the United States, historically it's not unusual for them to release some political prisoners as a sign of good faith. Generally, Washington will ask for that ahead of the talks, and generally the other government, if it's serious about the talks, will be willing to indulge them. It doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things, because ultimately you can just arrest those people later if they start causing trouble again. The Venezuelan security apparatus is still in place, so that's not a heavy lift for them. So that's mostly a symbolic move. I don't see that as indicative of true political transition. But I think if the only thing Washington asks for is symbolic moves of that variety, Caracas will probably be happy to indulge them. If and when Washington starts asking for more concrete commitments about democratization, I suspect Caracas will either lie, pretend to agree to them, and then just not do it, or maybe pretend to do it, but then corrupt the process such that they effectively rig the election and just win anyway.
Yeah,
And
you
if
could always
Washington,
get the job done super duper slowly in such a way that nothing really changes.
yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, they only really have to hang on for like 3 years, and then they could easily have a new administration that doesn't care about any of this shit. But regardless, like political transition is the one that they can kind of be the most ambiguous on. They can delay that relatively easily. And, you know, if the Trump administration really presses the issue, they can just ignore them and put the Trump administration in a position where they've gotten most of what they want, where they have oil coming out of Venezuela, hypothetically, more investment by American oil companies, and an end to Venezuelan oil subsidies to Cuba. You know, they'll have gotten like most of their asks in that regard. Is it worth it then to just scupper the whole thing over a lack of political transition? Well, whether or not that's the case is going to depend on how much the Trump administration actually cares about democratization in Venezuela, rather. And I mean, how much do people think he really cares about that? Like, probably not much. He's given every sign that he doesn't give a singular flying fuck about democratization as a foreign policy objective to any degree. So if that's the case, then the Venezuelan government would probably be making a pretty good bet if they move forward with most of those concessions, as I outlined them, except for political transition. The Trump administration would probably be willing to accept that as a compromise. Marco Rubio would not like it. I strongly suspect that he really was hoping that he could pressure the Venezuelan government into doing a lot more than just acceding to American demands on ambiguously defined economic interests. But I suspect Trump is going to overrule him when the rubber hits the road. Like when it comes down to it, Trump just doesn't give a shit about that stuff. So I think Rubio is going to be disappointed. And I kind of half wonder whether or not he might resign over it. Probably not, right? Because he is kind of more interested in power than he is in policy. He's very much a social climber from what I've seen of him. So I suspect he'll hang around even if Trump makes him do a bunch of stuff that he really doesn't want to do. But that's my thinking for how this is going to play out. If I'm right that the Trump admin is going to ultimately compromise on democratization, then them allowing American oil companies into Venezuela so that they can export more oil is basically just going to be giving the Chavistas what they had wanted before the kidnapping of Maduro. Washington will have at that point effectively adopted the Venezuelan position. I think the only question at that point is what the terms of oil distribution will look like. That is to say, how much of the revenue from selling Venezuelan oil that is being distributed by Washington is Washington actually going to give back to the Venezuelan government? That's more of an open question. And if it's not enough, Caracas may well basically just tell them to fuck off and in doing so effectively dare them to intervene more in Venezuela. And keep in mind, the more America intercedes and intervenes in Venezuela, the more likely there is to be an actual government collapse, at which point they're not going to get any oil, but they will get a whole bunch of Venezuelan migrants, which nominally is one of the objectives that they want to deal with. Okay, so Cuba. So over the past week or two, the government has been talking more and more about Cuba. Trump specifically said recently that Cuba needs to, quote, make a deal now before it's too late, end quote. And the loss of oil, basically free oil from Venezuela, is definitely going to be a problem for them. What I have in my notes here is that the oil that Cuba had been receiving from Venezuela was equal to about half of their oil deficit. So they do produce a little bit of oil, but obviously the demand exceeds that. So about half of that deficit they were getting from Venezuela. So losing that is going to be a problem. It's not necessarily going to be an immediate economic shock because they do have some options. They will be able to try to buy some off the market from alternative sources. They actually already buy some from Mexico, interestingly. But overall, the amount of oil they get is going to fall. They just don't have the foreign currency to completely replace all of that Venezuelan oil. So while the effect may be delayed, there will be a dramatic impact on the Cuban economy, which is already really struggling, which is why the Trump administration has been chortling about not needing to intervene in Cuba because it's about to collapse anyway. That's probably overwrought. I was reading recently in FP magazine that the Cuban government will take a hit from this, but most likely they'll be able to hang on because they've been through difficult periods economically like this before. There's some debate about this, but it's quite possible that the 1990s was worse than the current period economically for Cuba. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost an immense amount of subsidies that it had been receiving from the Soviet Union. And that created a pretty dire economic shock that lasted through much of the 1990s. It was a very difficult period for them. So the Cuban government was able to survive that, partly with basically just suppression, but also just because there wasn't really much of an alternative. Civil society in Cuba has been thoroughly suppressed by the authoritarian government. And anti-government figures find it very difficult to organize or otherwise operate. So between ongoing state suppression and the lack of civil society alternatives to the Communist Party, it's unlikely that the opposition is going to be able to leverage this. You know, maybe they surprise everybody and there actually is mass protests that result in a change of government, but it's not looking that way for the moment. We shall see. The proof will be in the pudding. Once the economic shock from losing Venezuelan oil really hits, we'll see how things pan out. But the experts that I were reading were suggesting that they would probably be able to pull through this. I almost kind of suspect, given how much the administration has been talking about Cuba in the past week, that maybe Cuba was maybe the real target all along. Maybe it really wasn't about the drug trafficking or any of the other bullshit that they mentioned as a casus belli. Maybe it was just about ending oil subsidies to Cuba and heaping pressure on them in the hope that the government would fall. That would not surprise me if it was Marco Rubio's true objective, because going after the government in Cuba has definitely been one of his objectives over the course of his political career. But I don't know how invested Trump really is in it, which is why I hesitate to say that's the real reason for the Venezuela drama. I think either way, it's foolish. I don't think either government is going to give significant way here, especially the Cuban government. The Cuban intelligence agency punches way above its weight. It's been very impactful over the course of its history, both in terms of suppressing domestic dissent as well as in terms of penetrating U.S. intelligence. It seems like every 10 years or so, there's a revelation that some high-ranking figure in the Latin American intelligence apparatus and the United States intelligence apparatus turned out to be a Cuban agent. I think it was during the first Trump administration, like around 2018 or so, like the head of the Latin America branch, basically, of was it the CIA, either the CIA or the NSA, turned out to be just a deep Cuban agent who they'd been sponsoring for like 30 years or some shit. Very senior official. Like, that was a very strong asset for them. And they had access to her all through all kinds of drama. You know, the Iraq War, the 1990s, the Cold War. Like, there's probably not a whole lot of big dramatic stuff that was going on as far as foreign policy decision-making in Washington that the Cubans were not able to learn about through her. And if the Cuban intelligence knew about it, then probably Cuba's allies knew about it. So probably the Russian and Chinese governments were probably pretty well informed about at least some of the higher level discussions about things like Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East, the Islamic State airstrikes and operations, as well as just general disposition towards Latin America, China, and Russia. They were probably taking advantage of that asset to keep tabs on all of that stuff. And while she was caught, like, I would be surprised if they didn't have more assets within US intelligence. The human intelligence game of Cuban intelligence is just really good. So I expect them, given their A game, to like still have assets in the government, and they probably know a lot about what the US government has been up to over the past couple of years. Well, certainly the past year with the Trump administration. Makes me wonder why they weren't more well prepared for the Maduro raid, and maybe that they just didn't figure it was worth it. Assuming they knew about it ahead of time anyway. It's entirely possible the US government was actually able to keep that raid secret. Maybe that's why they weren't more well prepared.
Definitely caught the world by surprise. That wasn't something that we thought was impending.
Yeah, they kept it under wraps as far as the broader public goes. You would think, given penetration into groups like the CIA and the rest of the intelligence apparatus, they might be more well prepared for it, and it seems like they weren't. So either they knew about it and didn't care, or they just didn't know about it at all. One or the other.
Well, lots of new drama in the Americas developing then.
Yep, and none of it really brings any strategic advantage for the United States, contrary to what Mr. Stephen Miller was saying. He gave a press conference, or he was at a press conference, more like, in which he was questioned about U.S. actions in Venezuela, and he made some very hearts of iron style comments about how, the only thing that really matters in foreign policy is force. Historically speaking, that is the main determinant of relations between nations. Something to that effect. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was some real gamer shit.
That's corny. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very much amateur hour in Washington as far as foreign policy goes anyway. Like, the stuff I hear out of the Trump administration just seems so neophyte. Like,
and
these guys.
Do you think the foreign policy thing mattering being force specifically is because most units don't have force resistance?
I don't know about that.
It's a pretty good damage type.
It's true.
There's a lot of fire resist out there. Not as much force resist.
Touche. Yeah, but there's just so much more to foreign policy than just force. And, one of the advantages the United States had historically before Trump is that the foreign policy establishment recognized that and was able to leverage a lot of soft power into tangible alliances and cooperative agreements that allowed the United States to project force in the world with minimal resistance. Like, the idea that the international order restricts and restrains the United States unnecessarily to a degree that's damaging to American foreign policy implicitly assumes that the international order is not itself an expression and projection of American power, which it is. It was explicitly designed to serve American interests, which it did and still does. So when you attack that, you're just attacking American interests. Like, the Trump administration is just so backwards on foreign policy, they're literally cannibalizing American foreign policy. Like, it's absurd stuff.
Because historically, I guess World War II is kind of the war that made the U.S. into a superpower and then also put them in the good guy seat of we were a big part in dethroning the main villain, therefore we demonstrated that we're doing stuff better. So we're a world leader not just in like military tech, but then also in democracy, or is how we have presented ourselves. And we do have different branches of government that all have weight and so on, and we've definitely done our fair share of bad stuff. But because we helped a lot in World War II, a lot of countries trusted us a lot after that. They're like, hey, wow, thanks for coming over here and sending so many people and being fully committed to this. But yeah, there isn't really a reason to then now attack our allies. Like, if you put forth all that effort, you spent those human lives and resources to fight wars with these countries that now stand by you, and you've made, as you said last week, security commitments to protect them, and there's no reason to be hostile. You can always do trade or something else, because everyone knows that we have a crazy strong military and we can do a bunch of stuff. So we have that leverage. It doesn't need to be used on people who are not really hostile to us.
Yeah, well put.
Go for the trade and science win now. We're ahead in military already.
Well, like, even if you want to be a realist and go hard in terms of projecting American power, like, besides the fact that we already have international institutions that can let you do that and give you lots of tools to work with, there's also the fact that kinetic operations, military operations, are inherently expensive and have outcomes that are inherently unpredictable. You know, look no further than Iraq for an example of that. That was supposed to be a short and cheap operation that illustrated that the United States could overthrow a government and replace it very easily. And it had the exact opposite effect. It totally undermined the credibility of American threats in that regard. So you don't need to use kinetic operations like that to project force. Like, very frequently you can do so with indirect tools. And while those tools are not very sexy and don't deliver immediate satisfaction, they are often more impactful and, more importantly, more sustainable than just trying to throw your weight around militarily. It's smarter foreign policy. It's not sexier, but it is smarter, and it does work. I think we've talked before about sort of the Trumpian mindset, which is very much focused on dividing the world into power elites. Basically, everything is controlled by power elites of one kind or another. And the way to get what you want is to negotiate directly with them or to intimidate and bully them. One or the other. And that's sort of the Trumpian modus operandi. That's sort of like the logic behind a lot of what they do. But if you want to create a kind of Hobbesian state in which that is institutionalized, or more accurately, deinstitutionalized into the dominant status quo, where instead of trying to build international institutions that try to provide some degree of order to international affairs, instead you just tear all of that down and reduce everything to transactional negotiations between power elites of one kind or another. If you do that, you're creating instability, because inevitably this sort of concert of Europe style realist management of global affairs will collapse. It is predestined to fail, because that's exactly what's happened every time this has been attempted. This is sort of part of the fever dream of realism. Like, a lot of realists have this notion that the concert of Europe is a great example of the kind of world system that they think is good and necessary, if not inevitable, where you have powerful states negotiating their interests predicated on their respective degrees of power, and then reaching understandings that avoid conflict. And it's totally unsustainable, because in order for that to work, you need all of the leaders involved to be rational actors who are able to sit down, make a rational calculation about their power relative to everybody else's power, and then, more to the point, have enough understanding of their own position and leverage, as well as the other side's position and leverage, to sit down and have a negotiation that results in an acceptable, basically, division of interests between the involved parties. All of that takes a lot of maturity, insight, and none of that is present right now in the US government, near as I can tell. And inevitably, in any system that is designed like this, you're going to get an actor like that in one of the powerful countries involved. And whatever deals that previous governments made will just be cast aside. And eventually, you're going to get escalatory tit for tat escalation that results in the system falling apart into violence. And that's exactly what happened with the Concert of Europe. Eventually, it failed. It was kind of already failing from the start. There was actually a fair amount of violence in Europe during that time period. So realists are pretty wrong about that, too. But eventually, it just collapsed totally with World War One, if not even earlier, if you want to count some of the earlier tensions. But World War One definitely put an end to all of that. Any notion that that was sustainable was put to bed right there. And then any notion that they could learn from that mistake and then try to rebuild that Concert of Europe style international system was scuppered by World War II, which is even worse than World War One. Mm-hmm. And after that, you got the Cold War, which had all of the potential to result in a total destruction of civilization as it was then known. So the lesson was learned after World War II. They needed some international institutions. It wasn't going to work to just have a bunch of sovereign countries running around trying to stab each other in the back and then eventually starting a global conflict in which everybody fucking dies. That's dumb. It's dumb, it's inevitable. You know that's what's going to happen if you do it, so don't do it. So they built a liberal international order. It was flawed, but it did its job. And by abandoning that, the Trump administration is putting us on a track to a status quo in international affairs that is going to be violent, unsustainable, to a degree that is going to be bad for everybody, including the United States. It is not in the American interest to do that. You could be a realist and have a smart realist foreign policy. This ain't it. This is just deductively assuming that any and all international institutions are bad, and so we need to withdraw from them so that we can maximize sovereignty. Like it's a score that you have to maximize in a video game.
Damn, we are so sovereign right now.
Like, it's just so ignorant. You can have international institutions and throw your weight around. Again, most international institutions were specifically designed to allow and facilitate Washington throwing its weight around. There are just so many contradictions in Trumpian public policy, but certainly in foreign policy, like, this is a big one.
Interesting.
Well, before I forget, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, and we do appreciate the feedback. I want to make sure to throw it out before I forget again.
Good call.
Been getting it in a little late the last couple times. God, is it already 1?
We started at 11 your time-ish.
Yeah. Yeah, I may actually have to check out early here, because I've got to get up early to take a relative to see a specialist.
All good.
It's going to be an 8 a.m. start or so.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought about canceling tonight on that count, but I figured if I did cancel, I would probably just end up accidentally gaming until like 2 a.m. So
yeah,
if I'm going to do that, I might as well just do the segment then.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, well, however much you want to go, no pressure. I have to get up a touch early tomorrow as well, so in a similar boat.
Yeah, it works out. That's all I had for Venezuela. Let's see, there's just a couple of more. I should do Yemen. I was wrong about Yemen. So you can consider this a correction. So I really didn't think that the Saudis and the Saudi-backed government in Yemen would be able to mount a comeback and take back all the territory they lost to the separatists, the STC. And just in like a single week, they proved me dead wrong. They took back all of it. The Saudis started launching airstrikes, and the Saudi-backed government launched an offensive, and so they've completely retaken most of the territory. They lost to the STC in the ST's offensive at the end of last year. So, shows what I know. Also, one of the STC's main leaders fled the country, presumably with Emirati help. And the Saudis say that the STC has agreed to disband, although the council that leads the STC has said that no final decision has been made. We'll see how that works out, but it looks like the STC is getting knocked back on its heels here. So it looks like Saudi and their allies in Yemen were more robust than I gave them credit for. I don't think the STC is giving up yet. They did say that they were going to try to hold mass protests in Aden, which is the main city in southern Yemen. But the Saudi-backed government is apparently moving to suppress dissent in Aden, so that may not work. Something to watch. It's still not as bad as when I said that I didn't think the protests in Bangladesh would result in any significant change. And then the very next fucking day, the government stepped down.
Wow.
Yeah. So put those in my L column.
That's okay. Big of you to admit that you made a wrong call. It ends up making people feel very agreeable when you admit that you're wrong about something. That shows character, and it also shows humility. You don't know everything, you don't have all the correct information, you don't have perfect reasoning faculties. So sometimes you'll mess up. Big of you to admit that. I get to savor that as I'm incrementally improving at Dota and writing down my mistakes. There are some situations where I just get dunked on, and I didn't respect the power spike that happened, and I got killed, and it set my team behind, and I contributed to a loss. And it doesn't feel good to admit that. It would be better, or it feel better, to just be a god gamer who just figured everything out and just won all the time, but that's not very realistic.
Well, I did have another correction here. Somebody last time was asking about other anti-American dictatorships in Latin America besides Cuba and Venezuela that might be targeted by the Trump administration. And I said that I thought that most authoritarian governments in Venezuela were, besides Cuba and Venezuela anyway, were aligned with the United States, and that I couldn't really think of any good candidates that might be a target of the Trump administration. I completely forgot about Nicaragua. So that's the correction. The Ortega government in Nicaragua definitely qualifies. It is basically a Chavista government, although it's technically a Sandinista government. Ortega predates Chavista and Chavismo. He's kind of got his own thing going on there, but he's very much of a similar style to Hugo Chavez and later on Maduro. But I don't think the Trump administration has ever paid much attention to Nicaragua, near as I can tell. So I don't know how much danger the Nicaraguan government can be said to be in.
Yeah, I don't know of many Americans who could point to it on a map.
Well, yeah, that's an unfortunate indictment of the disinterest in the United States for geography and foreign affairs. I'm unfortunately something of an outlier in that regard.
It is between Honduras and Costa Rica in Central America.
Correct.
Pretty close to El Salvador, pretty close to Panama, and we have intervened in Panama.
Oh yeah. 1989. Well, let's see, just a couple of other items here. There's been some fighting in Syria. In the city of Aleppo, there's actually a small enclave of Kurds. And this Kurdish enclave has been there since the start of the Syrian civil war, way back in 2011, I think it was. And they've been hanging on through thick and thin. But the new Syrian government has decided that they need to have authority over that enclave, because right now they don't. It's technically controlled by the SDF, which is this sort of pseudo Kurdish paramilitary organization that the United States backs in eastern Syria. So the SDF is there. The Syrian government wanted them to incorporate themselves into the army, and to allow the government basically to directly govern the Kurdish territory there. The SDF was not willing to do that. And so the new government started fighting them, started shelling the territory. To their credit, the government did announce ahead of time that they were going to start shelling. They wanted to give people time to evacuate. But they did proceed with the shelling. There were some deaths, injuries, etc. The SDF accused them of genocide, of wanting to just push the Kurds out of the enclave entirely. The government said, no, we just want sovereignty over our land again, please. You may not like the new Syrian government, but it's not an unreasonable request, what they're asking of the SDF here. So they fought for a bit. The United States government kind of stepped in and mediated between the two, and eventually, after a couple days, an agreement was reached in which the SDF did agree to evacuate from the enclave. I don't think this involves full evacuation of the Kurdish population. I think it's just the SDF, as far as I know. So I don't think there's going to be any ethnic cleansing, per se, here. But that agreement is in the process of being implemented, so we'll see. We'll see what the Sharad government does once they actually do have full control over the enclave. Very difficult for revolutionary governments to kind of get their footing once they actually get power. Even though it's been more than a year now, it's still very difficult for them. No shock. Let's see. And let's see, a little Ukraine note. So there was a European conference about agreeing to some kind of deployment of forces to Ukraine after the war with Russia ends, in order to try to act as a deterrent to future Russian aggression. Apparently, that did result in a successful agreement that there would be such a deployment. I think the details are still a little foggy right now, but the fact that there is a general agreement that this is what they're going to do represents some progress. And it helps address some of Ukraine's concerns about security commitments that might be part of any peace deal with Russia. The downside of this, though, is that this basically does incentivize Russia to get as much land as they can get now, before agreeing to any kind of ceasefire or peace deal. Since the Europeans are only going to deploy this deterrent after the war is over, Russia then has incentive to keep the war going until they have as much of what they want as they can get, if not just all of it. Also, Moscow has said that they explicitly reject any outcome in which foreign armies or military forces are deployed into Ukraine. So presumably they're going to be dead set opposed to this. They may end up willing to accede to it in exchange for other things, in which case there may well still be a deterrent force deployed eventually. But at the moment, it's looking unlikely. It's looking more like this is going to incentivize further belligerence by Moscow.
What if we just phrase it differently as we're not deploying troops to Ukraine after the war. We're deploying very aggressively equipped mining companies to Ukraine.
I don't think Moscow's going to buy it. They're very much experts in that kind of logic. I think they'll see through it. They're very good at bullshitting. You can't bullshit a bullshitter. Okay, so we did Syria, we did Iran, corrections, Venezuela. I did have an item from a couple hours ago. I'm still reading the details on this. So Donald Trump and the Department of Justice are threatening Jay Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, with potential criminal charges.
Oh yeah, chat mentioned this.
Yeah, so this basically has to do with a renovation of the Federal Reserve's headquarters. The Trump admin says that it's gone way over budget, is much too expensive, and they think there might be criminal negligence, basically, on the part of Powell on account of his alleged mismanagement of this. And this is something they talked about briefly a couple months ago, and then it kind of went away, and now they're bringing it back, basically, threatening Jay Powell with potential criminal charges. Powell has come out and, somewhat surprisingly, has explicitly accused the Trump administration of trying to intimidate him in order to intimidate him into lowering interest rates, which is something Trump is on record as having demanded the Federal Reserve do on a whole multitude of occasions by now. So the Trump administration has tried to intimidate Powell and the Federal Reserve before, but Powell was never willing to come out and just explicitly say that he is being intimidated by the president, and by extension, the president thereby threatening the independence of the Federal Reserve. He generally stayed relatively quiet and just tried to defend his record and the independence of the Federal Reserve. Now he's gone beyond that. Now he is just saying, okay, he's just trying to bully the Federal Reserve. This is a threat to the Federal Reserve as an institution and its independence, which is a pretty lofty charge to make. Like, that's big deal. In a previous era of American history, that would be headline news for fucking months. As is, this is just another day in the week. This is just another day of the week in the era of the Trump administration. But this one may stick as a story because markets are going to be upset about this. Markets may have mixed feelings about this, that, or the other thing that the Trump administration does. But pretty much most market actors recognize the importance of Federal Reserve independence. That's critical. So if the Trump administration does effectively seize control of the Federal Reserve, market confidence in American monetary solvency, basically, is probably going to crater to some degree. And that's going to have dire knock-on effects for the overall economy. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe markets would just accept it, but whether or not they do is going to come down to how much confidence people have in the Trump administration, to responsibly administer American monetary policy without corruption or bias of one kind or another. And as you might guess, market confidence in that is just as low as it is in the general population. So it's unlikely markets will respond positively to that. So we're not there yet, but Trump has signaled in the past, even in his first term and in his second term, that this is something that he wants to do. And he's making another play now. He's been making a bunch of plays for the past week. The Federal Reserve now, Venezuela, Greenland, for whatever godforsaken reason. Like I mentioned at the top, like, the administration has been unusually dumb, even by their standards, in this January. So this is just the latest and greatest. Definitely keep your eye on this story, because this is the kind of thing important economic actors in U.S. politics, whom are very influential, will get excited about and will lobby the administration on. I suspect Scott Bessent had a very rude awakening when he got the message about this. This is the kind of thing that I suspect he very frequently has to rein the president in on. And no doubt he's in rein-in mode as we speak.
Pretty wild action to start the year.
Oh, yeah. One extra thing I'd point out here, this is something I tripped over while I was reading about this. The Federal Reserve Chairman, Jay Powell, his term is actually up, I think, in May of this year. So he's going to be replaced regardless, which kind of calls into question why any of this would be necessary. But for whatever reason, the Trump administration is making a big deal about it. But all they really have to do is wait until May, and then they'll get their guy as the head of the Federal Reserve. But an interesting note here is that Jay Powell is not going to go away entirely after he steps down. He is actually still going to be on the Fed's board. And he actually has it within his discretion, given the way the Fed board's rules are written, to stay on the board for up to 2 years after he steps down as chairman. And in doing so, he would actually be denying Trump a chance to appoint another person to the board. He's already done one. He's trying to sue to remove another board member so that he can basically get another appointee. And the more appointees he has on the board, the more likely he is to seize de facto control of the Federal Reserve, which is what commentators are worried about. So if Powell stays on, he could deny him another appointee. And that might actually be the real reason that Trump is going after them with the threats of criminal charges. This may be less about lowering interest rates right now than it may be about getting Powell to not only step down as chairman when his term is up, but also to forfeit his claim on a position on the Fed board after he steps down, so that Trump can get another appointee. So a little bit of political maneuvering going on, potentially.
I like the designation you made today of a social climber. It's someone who is interested in power, but more personal progression than a particular ideology. Some people are very much for the team or for the tribe or for the party or the idea, and they're willing to do whatever it takes as long as they kind of abide that, and that's their primary thing. They're more like principle and group driven, and then other people are more just individual progress driven, where you could have a different person in charge and it doesn't really matter. You're still going to try to figure out how to get into a more advantageous position.
Yep. There's a lot of those guys in the Trump administration right now. Yeah, a lot of policy guys who would normally be a part of a Republican administration either didn't want to serve under Trump or were willing to serve under Trump, but were not trusted by Trump because he saw them as establishment figures that might try to sabotage his populism. So a lot of those guys are not in the Trump administration, which meant that Trump has not had access in either of his terms to the best talent available in the public policy realm, at least as far as appointees. And the people he's had to settle on are generally like second or third tier guys with very fringe beliefs. You know, again, Stephen Miller is kind of a case in point, but there are other less dramatic examples within his administration. There's just a lot of people who are willing to work for a guy like Trump, who, by all accounts, is like a very prototypical bad boss, but are willing to put up with him if it means they get to advance their career. So lots of social climbers in there these days. But to be fair, there's always a lot of social climbers in politics. You know, it takes a certain amount of ego to think that you would be a good politician, a good leader, that you should be entrusted with the authority of a public office. There's always a little bit of that in virtually every politician.
Yeah.
But of course, Trump takes it to a new level.
Yeah. I should be king of the world.
Yeah. He's got an exceptionally large Caligula class ego. That's probably the main stuff I've got for today. And like I mentioned, turning in early would probably be a good idea, just so that I can drive properly when I have to get up early.
That is a good and wise call. We always appreciate your time here. Very excellent having you on. It's our longest running segment. There are lots of people who ask about you every day that we are leading up to Agent Smith, and usually a couple days before. Lots of excitement. If anything happens in the world, there'll just be a pop in during the week, and they're like, I can't wait to see what Agent Smith says about this on Sunday. So, very good to have you on as always. Chat, you are lovely. Thank you for your contribution and your support. Agent Smith for your time. And we will see you all in the next episode of Well Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.